to introduce our speakers for today. I'll do so in the order as they will come up. Our first speaker is my colleague from UCT, and she's at the Center for African Studies, Thuto Thipe. She'll now wear her hat as a speaker as opposed to a moderator, and she will speak on Black land and labor rights in early South Africa. The second speaker whom we hope will join us is MC Hloniphile Bebe, and she's completing a Bachelor of Laws at the University of Zululand, and she is going to speak to us about Indigenous law and democracy in South Africa. And like I said, hopefully she will join us, but if she doesn't, I think that we'll just have to go move on to the next speaker. And then our final speaker will be my other colleague, but from Stellenbosch University, Professor Amanda Hobbs, and she'll be speaking about the limits of multiculturalism, Angambin and the post-colony. So without further ado, Dr. Thuto Thipe, the floor is yours, and we look forward to hearing to what you have to say. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you. Oh, let me get my timer. I shouldn't forget now that I'm on this side about time. In this presentation, I'm going to explore the idea of consent that was established in the North Gauteng High Court and in the Constitutional Court in 2018 around people's right to refuse mining on their land. In both of these cases, the courts ruled that free, prior, and informed consent was necessary from people in communal areas for mining to go forward. The courts stopped short, though, of articulating what constitutes free, prior, and informed consent. Free consent in areas, traditional council that are under traditional council administration, as was the case with these two cases. The first of these areas is the current model of traditional governance that has retained the core framework, and models of appointment as the native administration system established by the colonies that formed South Africa, and then by the South African state from 1910 through apartheid. Native administration was painstakingly designed for domination. Over centuries, colonists stripped through law and through philosophy on which the settler state's logic operated, a range of rights and possibilities from people racialized as native. The traditional governance system that the democratic state is currently implementing has been designed for the administration of natives. With all of the intense divestments of rights embodied in that system, it has not been designed for the governance of active citizenry. In preserving the core elements of the tribal administration system in the democratic landscape, the state has retained the structures and the imaginative framework that allows particular people to be treated as native. The people who live in communal areas have had to fight not to be stripped arbitrarily of their land for commercial gain without their consent, speaks to the harm that is done by this model that the state is implementing. The struggles that Black people have experienced in democratic South Africa to hold on to their land, not to have land redistributed to them, but to hold on to the land in the 13% of the country under traditional council rule, is illustrative of the tribal administration framework working in the ways that it was designed to work. The second broad theme that I argue undermines possibilities of consent being freely given is the intensity of economic deprivation in areas under traditional council jurisdiction. Where the state has failed in providing adequate social safety nets for people and in developing the infrastructure to make possible the growth of economic activity other than exploitative extractive mining, it is forcing people's hand and creating an ultimatum between the loss of or the irreparable damage to land and an economic dead end that produces contexts where people are just surviving with little reason for hope that the next generation will have brighter prospects than the one before it. The conditions that fuel economic deprivation in traditional council areas were deliberately manufactured by a series of colonial governments, most intensely over the past 200 years. These colonial administrations demanded cash taxes to force Black people into wage labor. They led continuous land grabs that forced Black people to have to buy firearms to protect their land and go into wage labor, to have to buy back their land in cases where they had become landless. There are many of these laws and they're well covered in the literature. And this is a very short presentation, so I'll just list a few of them. And if there's interest, we can discuss how they worked to force people into the types of economic situations that we see today. But just a non-exhaustive list. In the first 20 years alone of the Union of South Africa's existence, there was the 1911 Mines and Workers Act, the 1911 Native Trusts and Administration Act, the 1911 Native Labor Regulation Act, the 1912 South Africa Defence Act, the 1913 Natives Land Act, the 1920 Native Affairs Act, the 1920 Native Urban Areas Act, the 1924 Industrial Coalition Act, the 1926 Mines and Mine Workers Act, the 1926 Native Affairs Act, the 1926 Masters and Servants Act, the 1927 Native Administration Act. So that was supposed to sound like the long list at the end of those adverts with the side effects, just because it is so exhaustive, the amount of work that was put into forcing Black people into the type of labor conditions that we see fueling people being forced off their land today in traditional council areas. And these acts are to say that the colonial economy was designed to strip Black people of the material security that would have allowed for economic independence. This imagining and articulation of this type of economy was premised on the creation of scarcity that would force Black people into low-paying, exploitative work. South Africa today has largely retained the model of economics developed under colonialism, and with this has inherited the logics of scarcity, understandings of what the economy's objectives are, including the hierarchies of what is important to the economy, and understandings of who the economy should serve, who the economy should serve, and understandings of what is reasonable to sacrifice to see the economy grow in ways that it was intended. In the colonial economy, Black people's lives, health, well-being were treated as reasonable sacrifices for economic growth. The environment also, particularly in the context of mining, was treated as existing for the purposes of advancing capital. Right now, in court papers that have been filed in the Johannesburg High Court, Sasol is arguing that it cannot be held responsible for the Black lung disease that miners contracted while working underground in their coal mines because these workers consented to working under dangerous conditions. This use of consent here just speaks to the necessity of unpacking what consent is supposed to do and how it's supposed to function to protect people, as it's set out, as the precedents from these two court cases are set out. But this argument from Sasol made me think of this justification of miners freely agreeing to work that would slowly and painfully kill them. Reminded me of a passage from Gardner F. Williams, the general manager of the De Beers Consolidated Mine in 1905. He published in Diamond Mines of South Africa, he said, quote, "When sheep or bullocks were killed at market, the natives hung about and returned exulting if the obliging butchers gave them the entrails to hang on festons around their necks to carry off smeared with filth. They fed, contented, day after day, on a few handfuls of mealies or ground maize, with an occasional chunk of refuse meat. They had little use for water except to drink, and they much preferred Cape brandy. After working all day and roving about and singing at night, they would sleep as soon as their heads touched the ground on the bare earth, without shelter or in a squalid hut with dirty sheepskin wrapped around them. These quaint Africans, mingling in the kaleidoscopic show with adventurers coming from the ends of the earth, made a unique moving drama on the stage of the diamond fields that can never be forgotten by any prospector, end quote. Like in the diamond mined field of Kimberley in 1905, mining corporations today continue to argue to the public that Black people enthusiastically consent to and are satisfied with exploitative, dehumanizing, and potentially life-ending work. My good friend, cultural studies scholar Nicole Sarmiento, got me to stop using the phrase natural resources. She pointed out that the minerals below the ground only become resources through a particular configuration of the economy in which the land on which people live and farm and worship, often in ways that have been continuous over many generations, is seen in terms of the value of those minerals to drive profit. In another imagining of the economy, those metals are part of the landscape and composition of a place in ways that are similar to wildflowers or to rock formations. In moving from the language of natural resources here, I'm trying to disrupt the capitalist logic embedded in this languaging that assigns a value to these metals and stones that dwarfs the value of everything else that exists alongside and in relation to them. In the current configuration of our economy in South Africa, with its emphasis on, quote, development, and as President Ramaphosa often reminds, of foreign direct investment, the languaging of precious stones and natural resources speaks to the priority of increasing capital and trusting that this wealth generated will trickle to workers driving the industries. Where generating capital is understood as society's pinnacle, it becomes justifiable to sacrifice livelihoods and even lives to achieve this. Workers' health, the environment and wildlife that depend on particular ecosystems, people's homes and ancestral land become justifiable collateral damage to the increase in economic growth. So now back to the cases that established consent in the courts. In the final months of 2018, years of legal battles by people living in parts of the country demarcated as communal areas came to a head over their tenure security where there was the possibility of mining. Some of the largest known deposits of quote unquote precious metals have been discovered in South Africa's communal areas. In such areas around the country, people have waged struggles against governing traditional leadership structures, which have entered into agreements with mining companies to exploit their land. In many of these cases, traditional leaders have agreed to mining without the consent of people who live on and own the land under customary law. And in many other instances, they have acted in direct contradiction to people's expressed resistance to mining. In Maledu and others versus Itireleng Bakhatla, mineral resources and another in the Constitutional Court, and in Baleni and another versus Minister of Mineral Resources in the North Gauteng High Court, people sued to prevent traditional leadership structures in their respective areas from forcing them off their land to pursue mining. In both Maledu and Baleni, the courts affirmed that without free, prior, and informed consent from the people who lived on and used the land under customary law, traditional leadership structures could not unilaterally enter into agreements with mining companies to evict people from their land. So I see I've got 2 minutes left here, and to understand this, we have to understand how it is that traditional leaders came to be the representatives of people living in these parts of the country under traditional leadership. And this comes to the breakdown to the configuration of native administration, which has been reclassified as traditional governance. In many communal in many communal areas, traditional leaders have been interpreted as the final authority because the traditional councils, which are made up of 40% appointed leaders, 60% appointed leaders and 40% elected members, end up making decisions for the community. So with the power to appoint 60% of the traditional council, traditional leaders are often able to sway decisions in their favor. This power was granted by the Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act of 2003, which was developed to replace the 1927 Black Administration Act. It replaced it in name, but it retained the geographic boundaries, the leadership structures which had developed under the Native Administration framework. So the TLGFA recognized pre-democratic tribes as traditional communities, chiefs as traditional leaders, and tribal authorities as traditional councils. The model stayed the same as the names changed. The Maledu and Baleni judgments arose from very different historical trajectories on opposite ends of the country. In Maledu, the applicants were descendants of a group of people who bought land in 1919, but were unable to hold the title deed to this land and had it registered under the tribal authority of the day. In Maledu, people were living on their ancestral land and resisting mining on what was land owned under customary law. What bound these two cases together, even with their very different histories, was the model of tribal administration that was blanketed across what's now the Northwest and the Eastern Cape to force them under the same governance system. I'm recognizing how quickly time is going, so I'm going to skip to the end here to speak to the current moment. So the Baleni case is also famously the Koloveni case, which has received a lot of attention in the media, in part because it's some of the most pristine beachland in the country that people have been fighting to retain for more than a decade now, and where the famous Bondoland revolts against the apartheid government's use of tribal administration happened, as famously documented in Governor Mbeki's Peasants' Revolt. In the past week, the Amadiba Crisis Committee, which is a representative of several of the households resisting mining Koloveni, discovered that even though the North Gauteng High Court had said that mining cannot go forward without free, prior and informed consent, the municipal development plan for the area has put mining at the center of economic development, doing this again without consultation with the community and in contradiction to what the courts have said is the right way to proceed. So even in the exact case where the courts have ruled, we see municipal governments going ahead with plans for mining, in part with the support of the senior traditional leader of the area, who's also a director of the mining company that would be mining in the area. So we see in traditional council areas a context where people are not able to assert their rights as democratic citizens because they're forced under a model of governance that is stacked against them. And mining companies in the states continues to lean on senior traditional leaders as interpreters of what should happen and how it should happen. Whether it's people who were forced under tribal administration, who are former landowners, or people who were forced under tribal administration on their ancestral land. So the Maledu and Baleni cases bring to the fore the extent to which colonial categories of difference continue to make people in communal areas vulnerable to abuse of power and to tenure insecurity on their land. Over centuries, the titles given to Black people by the settler states, whether native, Bantu, or tribal, were invested with social and political ideas of exploitability and inferiority, which were codified in law and embedded in governing institutions to make colonial imaginings material and enforceable. In retaining core features of these legal structures, the state has created a context in which people's land exploitation in communal areas has been allowed to live on, and in some cases to flourish. The reasoning that colonial administrations gave for why people racialized as native could be deprived of certain rights, or why people identified by the state as tribal only belonged in certain parts of the country, became embedded in the legal system to the point that they could be evoked without being referenced. People not being consulted about proposed mining on their land or mining on their land or their land being used against their will illustrates how Black people in communal areas continue to face tenure insecurity. And it speaks to why people in these situations have turned to the Constitution and to its promise of equality and redress for past injustice in the courts. When Saul Plaatje condemned the Land Act, which went on to provide the geographic boundaries for tribal governance system, he lamented that the state could, quote, confiscate our birthright to the soil of our ancestry, end quote. More than a century later, people whose land rights were framed by that tribal governance system have had to fight in the courts so that their consent be required for their birthright to be known. In Maledu, the Constitutional Court has unequivocally required free, prior, and informed consent, and in Baleni as well. We see this has not changed what's happening on the ground in Xolobeni and in other parts of the country where municipal governments are going forward and in many ways eliminating possibilities for other imaginings of the economy. Where tourism is being advocated for in Xolobeni, there is very limited infrastructure. There are few roads that lead to that area. There are few ways for people to access these sites. And mining is being put forward as the only way that economic growth can be imagined. And economic growth is then justified as important enough for people to lose their lives, their livelihoods, and their ancestral homes. So consent is a concept that demands that we interrogate the context in which people are demanding rights, the context in which they are being exploited right now and being deprived of their land ownership rights. Consent can't be taken in an abstract and has to be applied contextually to how people are living in communal areas right now. Thank you.
It's definitely something that resonates a lot with me, and I think that there'll be a lot of questions and opportunity for debate and discussion afterwards. Our next speaker, I don't think that the second speaker is here, so we'll just move on to the third speaker, Professor Amanda Gouws. The floor is yours. Is Prof. Amanda Gouws?
If you can just switch on your camera and your mic, then you can come online.
Prof, it's those two buttons at the bottom that says cam on and mic on. I can see that she's here. Oh. There we go. Prof? Amanda, it's if you just click on them, where it says cam, I mean, even if you click on the arrow and just see whether it does anything, because it should give you some options. It should say something like they should turn green. Maybe just try once, just a quick one. I don't know whether the conference organizers can maybe assist here, or whether
Hi there. Yeah, the conference organizers will be in touch quickly with Professor Gouws just to sort that out.
Okay.
They're going to phone her now. If we can just hang 10 for a few minutes. Well,
okay, let's maybe do that. Yes, I think that maybe in the meantime we can all think about the questions that we would want to ask Thuto. I think that really Dr. Thipe has really like brought about some very, very interesting questions around traditional leadership structures, their significance, and I suppose tying it into the previous session around what role the courts have here in that have the courts somehow redefined the kind of implicit late colonial and late apartheid social contract in these sort of former homelands in ways that could in fact empower people. I think that there's a lot there that is very, very loaded, and that I think that we can definitely unpack. And so yeah, let's just think about what we'd like to ask, and yeah, let's just hang 10. I see there's some questions already coming in.
Prof. Lobby, perhaps we can continue with some of these questions for Dr. Thipe.
Okay, sure. All right.
As we sort out the cross-process problem.
Okay. I think maybe we can, Dr. Thipe, are you fine for us to take some answers to these questions?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I sped through that presentation. There was a lot more to it, so I'm wishing I'd taken it a bit.
No, we want to hear more. No, want to hear more. So the first question comes from Ongamam Timka, who says that are there examples where relationships between tribal authorities, mining companies, or those from other economic actors?
Thank you.
Oh, Amanda. Okay, you're there.
Yes.
How are you doing, Amanda?
Good morning. Thank you for waiting. And thanks to the organizers for this opportunity to talk to you. What I'm doing here is a rather dense theoretical argument. So my PowerPoints are quite full, and I don't normally do PowerPoints like that, but it's just to help me with the argument. Let me just talk a bit about the origins of this paper. In this year, the Canadians celebrate 50 years of multicultural policy, and they asked me to write a paper on basically the success of multiculturalism in South Africa, because they think of the Rainbow Nation idea, the creation of a liberal democratic state, as a success story. So I reflected on this, and I reflected on the state of the democracy we're in, and I thought, I cannot write that story. My previous work was a theoretical work on Agamben. For those of you who know Agamben's work, I applied that to the high levels of sexual violence in South Africa because of the idea that, Agamben's idea of a bare life, to show that it's not only death that causes a bare life, but it's also the issue of rape and sexual violence. So I thought I'm going to look at the notion of sovereignty from the perspective of Agamben's theory. The next slide. So the concept of multiculturalism does not really apply to South Africa, because in multiculturalism in post-colonial societies is being undone by the legacies of colonialism, and in the case of South Africa, the legacy of apartheid. What multicultural liberal democracies do is to erase colonial legacies and the violent operations of power without being able to undo the racism of colonial settlement. So exclusions from the polity are aggravated by the constitution of the liberal subject as an individual rights bearer, without accounting for the relationship of the liberal subject with its community. Rights are juxtaposed with culture in a way that positions culture as inferior to rights. We often hear this idea of harmful cultural practices, and then we think of people who are living, for example, under customary law. For multicultural policies to work, there needs to be a dominant culture that sets the societal values, and South Africa does not have one. So if we look at countries like Australia or Canada, there is one dominant culture, and then the protection of other cultures and the celebration of cultures, but as minority cultures. And in the South African case, given our history, there is no such culture, dominant culture. Next slide. But I was also interested in the notion of sovereignty as in relation to land, because in South Africa, I think the issue of land dispossession looms large in relation to sovereignty. So identity is not only dependent on cultural resources, but there is a strong connection between identity and place or land, because land is a marker of belonging and citizenship. The significant pushback against recent waves of influx of migrants into multicultural societies in Europe relates directly to contestation over place and the destabilization of the core values of the dominant culture, threatening to uproot multiculturalism. In post-colonial societies, landlessness is a stark reminder of colonial dispossession. So forging multicultural societies out of territorial segregated communities, plural legal systems like civil and customary law that Professor Mamdani talked about last night, and uniting colonial imposed identity groups in a bounded territory also entailed a redetermination of considered minorities and majorities, and who are included as citizens and subjects. In this regard, processes of decolonization have to address the challenges of embodiment or racialization, the construction of colonial subjects as backward, barbaric, and uncivilized that informs identity formation of the settler and subject, since identities exist in relation to each other. And of course, these identities then are also connected to land. And as the previous speaker has shown, how being put under traditional leadership still dispossesses them of land in many cases. Next slide. So the processes in South Africa, the slow processes of land reform have contributed to the precarious lives of rural farm dwellers and rural landless people. And I'm specifically looking at rural landlessness in this paper because of the whole situation around white farmers who claim to be victims of a white genocide. So this results in what Agamben calls bare life. So rather than drawing on liberal theories of multiculturalism, I want to draw on Agamben's theory of the homo sacer, analyzing post-colonial sovereignty through the state of exception and bare life, which are the antithesis of multicultural sovereignty, to illustrate how processes of marginalization and exclusion continue despite post-colonial sovereignty. So Agamben's theory, he makes the argument that in late modernity, there are two types of life, the Zoe, which is life in general, and Bios, which is a life of political significance. But for those who are not included in the life of political significance, they become reduced to bare life, a life of political insignificance that also make them really the targets of violence and death. And that is called a state of exception. So in South Africa, many people live in a state of exception because even though they are regulated by law, they are actually not protected by that law. And I think here the issue of landlessness becomes very important. I will also show how the shift from majority to minority status. So now this is the shift of white people from having political power to minority status. So I'm not talking numerical majorities and minorities here, allows white farmers who own the biggest proportion of agricultural land. If we look at the statistics, about 76% of the land are still owned by white, the white population versus a very small proportion by the black population and specific agricultural land. To claim the white farmers to claim that they've become the victims of a white genocide due to the murders of white farmers and are suffering from bare life because they lack the protection of the state. So I think the role of the state here is also very important in the sense that we make very progressive laws. We have a very progressive constitution, but the state fails in its implementation of legislation. And I'm going to show how it affects both the rural landless and the white farmers. Next slide. So if we look at Agamben's notion of sovereignty, so at the heart of his theory is an understanding of sovereignty as a decision over life and death. Who gets banished to a bare life and who has the power to suspend the law to create a state of exception. The state of exception has hardly been a state of exception for colonized peoples, where race and coloniality are central to the constitution of modernity and the making of its sovereignty. So even though, you know, the focus for Agamben is on who gets to live a bare life, and it's the decision over life and death, but he does not engage sovereignty in relation to territory. So sovereignty relates to bounded territorial jurisdiction and how political authority is exercised over this territory. The relationship between authority and bodies determine membership in the political community. Sovereignty, therefore, is a relational concept, the relation between the rulers and the ruled, and is context dependent. The context of the settler colonial state in this case, so I mean, South Africa is a settler colonial state, even if we may not think about it in post-apartheid terms as that anymore, we still have the legacy of settler colonialism. State territory precedes law, creating a form of governing of life that the law codifies and preserves. And just to go back to the previous speaker, we see those laws, how it codified and preserved certain ways of access to land. It is also a process of boundary making through establishing a relationship between the legal and non-legal as a way to determine who is citizen and who is exile. Because in the sense of Agamben's theory, he's very concerned with those who are exiled to a bare life. Next slide. Settler colonial identities are also directly related to land as an agricultural project, a potent symbol of settlers' permanence coupled with the discursive construction of the native as non-agricultural, nomadic and rootless. To acknowledge the native as an agriculturist would confirm the permanence of their presence. In many settler colonies, this prevention of permanence led to genocide. In the South African case, it led to displacement of the natives from land, confining them to small pieces of land or bantustans. This is what Mandela calls the genocidal logic of colonial pacification. According to him, it is the violence that binds the settler and the native together in a chain of violence that becomes bigger than both of them. So this is also why settlers in South Africa and people who support that history is that there was nobody on the land. When they got here, people were not here. And so this is this idea that the native is not permanent, and it is not, they're not agriculturalists. Next slide. So in terms of settler colonialism, the settler state in South Africa relied on the logic of displacement rather than the logic of elimination. If we look at Patrick Wolf's term, he talks about the logic of elimination, and that's what happened in, for example, Australia, Canada, the United States, in terms of the indigenous populations that their numbers were shrunk through violence and genocide, and so that they are now small minorities in their ancestral land. So land was settled through processes of movement into the interior and claiming empty land or acquiring it through conquest as well as through lawmaking. Forced removals of Black people in South Africa started with the 1913 Land Act and was accelerated under apartheid. Conjoining land and identity that contributes to the contestation around belonging in the political community. So what we see today is still that contestation about the fact that the land redistribution is so slow, land restitution is also very slow, and there is this call for land appropriation without compensation. Next slide. So the policy for land reform that the South African government used up to the present is willing buyer, willing seller, relying on a market mechanism to encourage property owners to sell land at market value, a process through which the state could remain hands-off. The willing buyer, willing seller policy is costly to the state through its subsidization of acquired land, and it prevents the state from addressing land dispossession in a timely fashion. Using the market compounded the problem of landlessness and marginality by those who cannot access the market, an inability that is embedded in the history of agrarian formation in South Africa. So what we've seen here is that there's still, even now with a shift, I think, in the thinking to land appropriation, the lack of access to land and the marginalization of those who do not have land in very much in a way of bare life, living a bare life. And this also, of course, leads to the chronic situation of protest that we see in South Africa. I think Tivan Reddy's book on settler colonialism in South Africa really speaks to, he also uses Agamben's theory, and he makes the case that those who live a bare life and a life of political insignificance gives rise to the violence and the continuous protest that we see in South Africa. Next slide. So now the interesting issue for me is this whole issue of white victimhood that was triggered by Black Lives Matter in the United States. So there was a call in South Africa at the time that we should support Black Lives Matter, the hashtag Black Lives Matter campaign. And in a WhatsApp that went viral, an editor that works for Network 24 said that if you are white and you don't know the name George Floyd, you are part of the problem. And so in this WhatsApp, a nameless white man ranted, "Do you know the names of white farmers who've been killed?" So according to him, if you don't, you are part of the problem. In the months after Floyd's death, the racialized nature of the debate around Black Lives Matter was the most visible in the arena of sport. Lungi Ngidi, a black cricketer, expressed the need for the South African cricketers and the cricket board to take a stand on Black Lives Matter because of South Africa's painful history with apartheid and racial discrimination. In response to this, Rudy Steyn, a white cricketer, said in an online post, "I believe the Proteas should make a stand against racism, but if they stand up for Black Lives Matter while ignoring the way white farmers are daily being slaughtered like animals, they've lost my vote." This post discursively constructs white farmers as victims of racial violence to the extent that it constitutes a white genocide, obscuring the historically grounded nature and specificity of settler colonial power relations around land. Now, this notion of white genocide at that point went so wide that there was a delegation that went to Trump to say that whites need to be saved from this genocide. And Trump actually then had a whole task team appointed to look at this and was making the case of the violence against white farmers. And the Australian government then opened its borders for white farmers who wanted to resettle in Australia. Next slide. But this is not only the issue of land in this whole discourse about white victimhood is also deeply gendered. Because at the same time, Simon Roche of the Suidlanders warned in an interview with James Spock of Harper's Magazine about Black Africans' propensity for killing women and children that, according to him, predates white settlement in the interior and was worse than anything that happened in the Great Wars of Europe. He confided, "It is not about the land. It has got nothing to do with the land. It was about the plot to destroy whites." In the same interview, another Suidlander said, "No one will come to rape our women, 4, and that should be the number 4. 4 at a time here. They know we'll fuck them up." The counter discourse to this is what Black activist Andile Mkama of the radical Black First Land First told POC. The project here is essentially a race problem. The confrontation is going to be racialized. According to him, South Africa is a racial war zone of which farm murders is just another day on the battlefield. As he puts it to POC, we kill small ones, we kill old ones, we kill white people, of course, because we're killing ourselves. And why do we kill ourselves? Because we put in subhuman conditions. So on both sides, there's a racial and a gender rhetoric. On the side of whites, the colonial tropes of Black people is barbaric and prone to extreme violence and rape, the barbarians at the gate, while on the side of Black, structural violence of colonial settlement that caused bare life and the dehumanization for Africans that's raised on that side. So both groups claim to be victims and rendered into bare life. Next slide. So if we look at this gender nature, the process of colonization and settlement are also deeply gendered, as Stoller argues that gender and sexuality justice race were produced and mobilized in the intimacies of empire through the regulation of women's sexuality through violence in the colonies. While the victimization through sexual violence of white women is raised by the Suidlanders, there is a silence on the victimization of Black women. Just like any other women in South Africa, women on farms are exposed to very high levels of gender-based violence and sexual assault. Most intervention centers and shelters are located in urban areas so that gender-based violence on farms go unnoticed. So what we see here is if we just look, for example, at women on farms, the non-governmental organization and their work, the levels of gender violence on farms are really high. So what I'm arguing here, and it may seem a bit disjointed because it's a long paper and, like I said, a densely theoretical paper, is that we see if we apply the theory of Agamben to land and the issue of land in South Africa, we see that landlessness has not changed since the transition to democracy. So this notion of the rainbow nation success story is not something that really applies. And we, even if not looking at land, but at other issues of poverty, inequality, and the very large inequality gap that we've seen has actually deepened under COVID. But if we focus on land, we see that the rural landless and farm dwellers are really living a life of political insignificance and a bare life in Agamben's terms. And this is not to say that I do not think that farm murders is serious. If we look at the statistics, for example, up to 2017, there were 6,122 violent attacks on farms. There were 1,938 deaths, and of those deaths, 1,697 were white. So Black people also die on farms, but there is a significant statistic for the death of white farmers. Now, if you look at the homicide rate in South Africa, then that the farm murders is 7.7 out of 100,000, while the homicide rate for the country as a whole is 38.5 out of 100,000. But what we see then is the state and the role of the state here in first of all, not dealing with land redistribution and land restitution in a timely fashion, but it's also not protecting white farmers against the violence that happens on farms. So in both cases, the state has it has a share in what happens to the implementation of law and policies. But what we then see is this situation where you have the victims of landlessness claiming a bare life at the same time that you have farm owners claiming a bare life. And this then, of course, links them through a very, very violent processes, but very different types of violence. Next slide. So to conclude, the continuous protests and violence and land disputes, and this is, of course, exploited by parties like the EFF, who, call for land grabs, belie the notion of democratic transition to multiculturalism. It rather confirms Agamben's notion of a state of exception and bare life, especially for the landless. Thank you.
Provoking. And I think that we've got enough time for a vibrant debate. I'm going to start with the questions on the Q&A. There's a question by Nyasha Karimakwenda that's addressed to Dr. Thipe. And she says, thank you for the fantastic and evocative presentation. In the face of continuing violations of the law by municipalities, traditional leaders and mining companies, what recourse do communities have? And I assume that the second part of the question is linked to the first, in the sense that, in other words, how can communities protect their rights when powerful actors flagrantly ignore the courts? Dr. Thipe, are you available to maybe answer those questions?
Yes, absolutely. No, your question gets to the heart of what I'm trying to think through in this paper. That one of the challenges right now is, I think, the poverty of imagination that we have around what is possible, what could be possible, what should be possible, and our commitment to this this archaic imagining of the economy that privileges particular industries, whether or not they're actually still the most suitable for the country, whether they ever were the most suitable for the country. And so I think in thinking about how to make consent meaningful and real, I would want us to think more broadly around how to change the broader socio-economic or the broader context in which people are being asked to offer consent, offer or withhold consent. That we need a reimagining of economic possibilities and opportunities. A broader social security net that means that you won't starve if you don't take up this opportunity that's given to you. Because so much of the conversation, when I've worked in villages across the country, so much of the conversation is that we do want jobs and we do want opportunity. And I've predominantly worked with people who are opposing mining, but even they recognize that there is this necessity. But the fact that this is being presented as the only way through which people can get jobs and through which they can realize the sort of material stability and prosperity even that they want for themselves and for their families and loved ones and their society, I think is the problem. I think what I'm pushing us for is a broader reimagining of how the economy could be reconstructed. And this isn't a utopian idea. This is, the state has already committed to this in policy, to creating the social safety nets and creating the infrastructural landscape that would make possible different alternatives. The problem is the realization of these in practice. And these are themes that came up in the earlier morning panel as well, that we in many instances have dedicated the resources, the state has dedicated the resources, but they just are not having the impact that they ought to be having because of a multitude of political and leadership and individual reasons. But yes, I think that the state needs to put its hand on the scale in a more effective way, that it's not mining or bust, or it's not foreign direct investment or bust. There need to be more ways to think about how people can be. And in Kolobeni, like I said, with the tourism angle, people are saying that this is a more sustainable option that could last for hundreds of years and is is a desire, but it's so difficult to reach Xolobeni, and it's the one lodge there that is always full has been already assigned in this new municipal development plan to new stakeholders. It's a community-driven initiative, but because of the idea of the kinds of profits that should be generated by these sorts of projects, the municipal development plan is saying this is not actually in line with the sorts of development that the state wants to prioritize. And so it's actually undermining the existing tourism plans to create its own, instead of thinking through what people are saying they want to see happening and how they can see their lives being their own imagining of the type of wealth generation that could be possible. So yes, so I would say we shouldn't think about what is available right now. We should think about what we could make available and how we could go about doing that. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm going to move on to the chat because I think that people were also asking questions there. And so I'll just move on in a kind of from who came first. There's one from Ongamamtika, who said, I think that you do touch on this a little bit though, where he says, are there examples where relationships between tribal authorities, mining companies, or those from other economic actors and communities have worked positively to unleash development in communities? He, I think, is working in the Burgersfort area in Limpopo. Dr. Thipe?
Yes, I'm sure there are instances where they are working, and the question always is, what does working mean? The life of a mine with a long life is 50 years, and it's a very long life for a mine. And after those 50 years, the land is largely unusable. Instances, and water sources are often polluted, and air is often polluted, and the ecology is often devastated around that area. But yes, there often is wealth generation within those 50 years that impacts people's life prospects. So I think the question is what we understand as working and what we understand as productive. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'm going back to Q&A. I think that one was already asked. He asked in both cases. Then a question from Nomalanga Mkize. Is the problem traditional leaders intrinsically or the entire state? And I think that what she's saying is that she doubts that there would be any difference in response if these mining contracts went through municipal councils.
I agree. I do agree. And traditional leaders are employees of the state. They are appointed by the state, and they can be challenged. Their positions can be challenged if they are seen not in line with customary law and living customary law in the courts, but these are state-appointed actors. So again, I think it's a broader type of reform that would help realize the type of change that we're both, I think, referencing here. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to just jump into a question for both of you, just to bring in Amanda. And maybe, Amanda, you can start with this one. It's in the chat section by Ashraf Adam. And Ashraf Adam says that conquest and empires have existed for thousands of years and have always been related to access to wealth and resources. He further goes on to say, European colonization existed for only about 200 years. At the same time, late 20th and early 20th century hyperglobalization has impacted on human development in profound ways. So, Adam says, I wonder why there is this fixation with post-colonial studies and not a fixation on what human development in the 21st century is, and what the role of the state is in building such a society. Are we, he concludes, not being slaves to a narrative not of our making? Amanda, you can maybe tackle this one first. And then
well, I think it is an interesting question. And I think that if we look now, and I'm speaking as a political scientist, what we have done up to very recently is to use liberal democratic theories to try and explain what happens in colonial or in societies that have been colonized. And those theories fell quite short of explaining issues, for example, of landlessness, of marginalization and exclusion. So post-colonial theories, and I think the body of settler colonial theory that has been developed is very important, and in order for us to get a different handle on what the legacies of colonialism have been. So, I mean, human development, of course. I think if what I've tried to say in my presentation is look at what the state is doing here. The state is not capable of implementing very progressive legislation. And if I go to my work that I've done with Agamben and sexual violence, feminists have coined this term of the abandonment by the state. So what we see is that, an intimate femicide rate that's 5 times the global average. Nearly, if we take an enlarged statistic, a million rapes per year in South Africa. So that is, we see that, of course, the lack of development, the lack of human development, the lack of progress. And if you look at the raft of legislation we've made on sexual violence since 1994, then of course, that is exactly the problem, that the state and the liberal democratic state see the individual as a rights bearer that need to access those rights, and that has very little concern with people who are excluded from that access. So I think to say that the post-colonial types of theory cannot explain what's happening with human development, I just don't agree with that.
Thanks. Dr. Thipe?
I'm very attracted by the idea of what happens to ideas when they circulate around the world and apply to particular contexts. So I'm always interested in the ways, I work a lot with early 20th century Black intellectuals, and it's always interesting to see the ways that they took these theories of liberalism and made them work for themselves. So I think even this idea of post-colonialism, the question like, why are we relying on these theories? I think it's about what we do with them and how we make them real in our own contexts. That for me is what is meaningful with them, yeah. Okay.
Thanks. There's a whole conversation here between Ashraf and Nomalanga that's maybe for them. So y'all can do your thing. Q&As. I've got some of these questions break away, but then there's one that seems to be clear. Bongseni, and this is to Thuto. The cognate concept to economic development we often hear is development. How do we reframe development to begin to move away from the imposition from above involving, and I think that it continues, the kinds of exploitation and displacement you speak of?
No, this is the big question that I just saw in the chat, Prof. Mkhize's comment on the division within families. And this is what makes this so challenging, is that there is no one way of doing this. That even within places where, like in Xolobeni, it was a significant majority that won this court case to resist mining, but it's by no means the universal opinion. So thinking about how to move away from this idea of development, to me, context-driven, to use the overused phrase, bottom-up driven thinking about what people really need. That I think what I was trying to center in this paper is this idea that we have become so dependent on the colonial framing of what the economy is supposed to do and how it's supposed to work. And the function of the economy is to meet people's needs and to distribute resources in a way that allow people to live fruitfully. And so I think for me, we would move away from the stifling understandings of development by taking context-specific understandings of what it means to live fruitfully in different contexts and what's required for people to do that. And developed in our national legislative discourse that really takes pretty brute capitalism and neoliberalism as the only that is viable. And when we look around, as Professor Gouws has put so well, is it really working? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. One here for Professor Gouws from Nomalanga, who says, did the Canadians consider that multiculturalism there is different because they have rendered their Indigenous people into a minority? In South Africa, which includes the colonized are majority.
Yes, indeed, and I mean, this is the logic of displacement versus the logic of elimination. So in Canada, for example, you had a logic of elimination, so that the native population are now very small. My previous work has on gender and multiculturalism, where I worked with a Canadian scholar, I tried to exactly make this point, is that in South Africa, you know, if we go back to what Professor Mamdani said last night, so there, you know, there's still this notion of ethnic groups that's being reproduced and reinforced because of the types of legislation that has given more power to traditional authorities. But if we do not think in terms of ethnic groups, then there's an African majority in this society, and so this does not, you know, I just think that the concept of multiculturalism does not apply, and that we shouldn't force it onto South Africa.
Okay, thanks, man. I think there's a chat. Okay, I think that maybe let's move on to this last question from Chokozile, and I think that it's really, I think, quite at the crux of it, I think, and both with regard to the last two sessions, in that, yes, given that we've all now given this, you know, these wonderful, elaborate discussions on the complexities of all of this, what is to be done? I love these questions, and maybe we can, and maybe Dr. Thipe, we can maybe start with you, and then we can move on to Amanda. What is to be done?
I also like these questions because they force us to think about how to make utopia real. Because for me, like, we must always be striving for utopia. So for me, the first one is native administration must go. In both the cases that I referenced, people identify very loudly, very proudly as Bakatla Bakafela in Northwest and as Amampondo in the Eastern Cape. So it's not a question of people rejecting African-rooted governance systems or the identities that are related to those systems, to those political and governance systems, but it's about this fixation on this very stifling model that comes out of the Natal colony into the 1927 Act, into the 1951 Act, into the 2003 Act. So for me, that's one starting point, is do away with that model. I'm a fifth generation Joburger, and I was raised very much with an understanding of African governance and leadership structures. This idea that this is something that is confined to 13% of the country, I think should be offensive to all of us. And then thinking seriously about how the state creates conditions for people to prosper and not just to survive. I think this, for me, this discourse around mining, a lot of it is around survival. When you look at what Black people their land and what that money that they get is able to do for them in their lives, and especially over a long term, it's about survival. And I think thinking seriously about moving beyond survival. So for me, that's the state being more involved in realizing the plans that it's already committed to around, we spend so much money on education, education being fruitful, seeing the results of this financial investment that's going in, a broader social safety net. There is significant impact that grants have in the country, but putting more money in more people's pockets, I think, around the world is shown to have major impact. And seeing the infrastructural development that has already been committed to being realized. So basically the state realizing what it's already committed to doing and is already putting the money into doing, that we are just not seeing where this money is going.
Thank you, thanks. Prof?
Well, I think, the issue here is what will lead to people leading a life of political significance, because this is the issue of social exclusion and marginalization, is that we will have to deal with this huge inequality gap. I mean, it's not sustainable. And to come back to the notion of the state, right? I think, that there may be people who think that the state is it's a concept that we should sort of discard it. But we all need the state. The problem with our state is that it is the nationalism that's embodied in the state. Nationalism as an ideology is a spent ideology, but it wreaks so much havoc in people's lives because, it is this idea of building a nation through a nationalist ideology that is really not delivering for people. And I think that's, we need to reconsider also what the state needs to do in terms of provision, yes, and how it implements its own laws. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know whether there are any other questions, because I think that we are done, given that there was the second speaker didn't come, and I think that we've really eaten up into the time that she was allocated. And so I'm wondering whether there's any more questions or any more points of clarity. I think that I've just got one, just to maybe abuse my moderator influence. And I think that, and I'm just very curious about this case, this Maleni case, and whether or not, and maybe this is Dr. Thipe, but the Prof also can maybe jump onto it, but whether or not there will be, at least if we think, any political significance of that case in relation to the structures of traditional leadership. As in, does it mean, given that, from where I sit, for example, right, all these chiefs, etc., have a very strong electoral significance. That is beyond just the kind of, economic, where they can make deals with whichever company and all these things. But then now, what would the implication be once communities are given that right to consent? Does that give some power away from these traditional structures first? And two, and I suppose now I'm trying to wrap it all up for the morning to link it to the first session, is that, well then, what then is the significance of law or of courts, etc., in perhaps as a vehicle for renegotiating that relationship? In light, obviously, of your point that you made just now, where these structures must go. Does that point for a new way forward or a new way towards that? It's a broad question, but
sorry. I think I missed the first part. Sorry.
Oh, what is the significance of the Maleni judgment in light of the kind of problematic nature of traditional leadership structures in communities?
The reason I brought in this question of labor as well is because I do think that the question of consent is such a loaded one. This idea that people could consent to dangerous work and therefore kind of deserve it when they get Black lung disease, I think is, to me, very, and then again to the Kimberley mine reference about just how happy these natives are for these scraps of food and this is all they ever wanted. To me is the broader question of what's required for consent. That I think that these traditional leadership structures have been a significant impediment to people's active citizenry and people's the respect of people's rights as citizens. But I think it's a much broader challenge. I think that the state's protection of private industry is major here. And whether it's to the point in the chat, whether it's a municipal council, whether it's a councillor who has stakes in private company and makes interest along those lines, or traditional leader who has interest in private industry and makes interest along those lines, the state is beholden to capital right now, and I think we're in an administration right now that is particularly invested in capital growth, or rather the discourses around capital growth. And I think that that's really limiting. So I think this idea of consent, they're the preliminary steps of the most obvious violation or impediments to that vitiate people's ability to consent. But I think that once we get past those, we have the much broader structural questions of who would consent to the sort of work that slowly kills you painfully and with no pay. You've already been discarded by that point to go and die alone, looked after your family. So those are the sorts of questions that I think are broader in our society, and across the board we can ask those sorts of questions. What conditions require people to consent to the sorts of things that we're being told they are consenting to?
Okay, thanks. I think there's one final question, and that's a request from Christy, and maybe it's for you both. And she would like both of you to, just as maybe a last word, reflect more on the gender dimension. That is, it would be good to hear more about how continued racialization in relation to land intersects with gender. Amanda, last words in light of this question?
Well, I think that, I've tried to make this argument in the paper, is that even though you have many women, African women living on farms, and there are very high levels of gender-based violence, that sort of goes unnoticed. But if we just take a step back and we talk about the Communal Land Rights Act, for example, that's given great powers to traditional leaders to distribute land. It means that often land's not distributed to women. So it means that women are, that gender inequality is reinforced through the powers that's given to traditional leaders. And that, of course, is problematic, because we've seen in other cases that, what actually contributes to gender equality is women's access to land, especially where women, work in subsistence conditions. So there's a strong link between gender and land.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. And Thuto?
No, I agree. I agree with Prof. Gouws' what she just said, and women disproportionately bear the brunt of all systems of oppression. So when we take down this neoliberal model, we have to take down patriarchy with it. And I don't just mean that as a poster, as a rhetorical banner, but when they said the right to say no, when they took when in the Maledu case, when they organized around the phrase, the right to say no, it was really powerful that discourses of consent were moving around different frameworks of oppression in that way, that a phrase that was popularized in sexual violence, around sexual violence, was being used to speak about the type of violence people were experiencing through land dispossession and alienation. So I think we see the deep relationships between people's insistences on the right to have a say over their bodies, their lives, and what happens with them in the ways that they're framing ideas of consent and what it means to resist different forms of domination and violence.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to thank everybody. I think that we have about 1 minute left, but I think that concludes this session. I'd like to thank everybody for very, very fruitful debate. I think that the chat certainly was very, very entertaining from where I sit, and I think that it does set the tone for a very interesting day. So thanks, everybody. I think that the way forward in terms of housekeeping, we stay as we are, I think, and we reconvene at 1 o'clock. Am I right, Christy? At 1 o'clock. And
yes, that's 100% correct.
Yes. Okay, and so therefore we can have a lunch break, grab some coffee, bathroom break, have something to eat, and then we're back at 1 o'clock for the session on African feminism in the post-colony. Thank you very much, everybody, for a good morning, and we'll see you in about 45 minutes. Thanks.